Welcome to the Tyler's Place podcast, the official podcast of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, Southern Jurisdiction. I am your host, Matt Bowers, 32nd degree Scottish Rite Mason, and today's guest is a guest that we've had on quite a few times before, and YouTube videos and the like. It is Brother Chris Rowley, 32nd degree KCCH. A lot of times it seems as though, and for all the right reasons, as I say in this podcast, that Albert Pike hung the Masonic moon.
Sometimes it may seem like Albert Pike hung the Masonic moon. No, in fact, he did, because it was dormant for 60 years. So he didn't just hang it. He had to pick it up off the ground, undust it, wash it off, dry it off, polish it, and then hang it. Now you see why Albert Pike said this was for the few, not the hundreds of thousands.
Hung the Masonic moon. But there were certainly other sovereign grand commanders of the Scottish Rite Southern Jurisdiction who made, if not an equal or possibly larger impact. A lot of this information is obviously of a historic nature, and some of it is certainly of a subjective nature.
Now, I would argue with you and say that there are two major ones that you would think, okay, these are the guys that really made significant contributions, who are lesser known. That's okay. Lesser known. James D. Richardson is number one. The second one from Alabama, George Fleming Moore, he succeeded Richardson. Let's go back to James D. Richardson. This ends as minority leader of the Democrats.
Okay.
And he is pitched and he becomes a Scottish Rite Mason sometime around 1881. He gets the 4 to the 32nd degree. Albert Pike, in fact, even helps confer some of those, the latter parts of those degrees in 1881. In 1885, here's the craziness. Within a couple months in 1885, the 3 years after he becomes a 32nd degree, within a couple months, he gets a KCCH, he becomes a 33rd degree, and he becomes elected an active member of the Supreme Council within a couple months.
Wow.
That's before the rules got set up where there's a certain time frame associated.
So the law just changes, right? So Albert Pike assists him in getting in, but then all of a sudden now he's a part of a democracy, which he flies through the degrees, what he said. Well, Albert Pike states, under a democracy, they are so as a means of attaining popularity in office and because of the greed for wealth. Democracy and despotism favorable to the prevalence of falsehood and deceit is what he has as an index.
He serves in that role for 14 years. For close to 2 decades. 4 years later, he becomes the Lieutenant Grand Commander. So within a process of 9 years, close to a decade, he goes from becoming a Scottish Rite Mason to serving as a Lieutenant Grand Commander. Now, Thomas H. Caswell, who is one of these short-term Grand Commanders after Pike's death, when he dies in 1900, he comes in and is elected the Grand Commander. So from 1881 to 1900, he's basically, he shifts and becomes the Grand Commander of the Supreme Council. During that time, you ask, well, Chris, what are his contributions?
Right.
During that time, which is, I think, one of the most important, he helps facilitate the selling of the original House of the Temple.
And that's exactly why I sit here and do what I do. He said the most important contribution that this man gave was the selling of the temple to build another temple, which really was an excuse to get their hands in the treasury funds. And what did they do? They pulled Albert Pike from his grave. In his will, it said he wanted to be buried in an unmarked grave. What did they do to honor him? They pulled him from his grave and put him somewhere else to try to get into the treasury fund, using the excuse about transferring the properties to the other brothers and all of that, and using one of the buildings to pay for the temple. That is a lie. We went over the building of the new temple, and that value far exceeds the value of the other property.
At the groundbreaking ceremony for the second House of the Temple. Mm-hmm. He is the guy that helps facilitate the sale or the transition, because it's not really a sale. The old building gets given to the D.C. Scottish Rite.
Right.
D.C. Scottish Rite sells their building in order to keep the original House of the Temple, and then the money that they had for that goes into the construction of the House of the Temple. To finance the construction for for the house of the temple that we have now on 16th Street. In fact, we have a great photograph of him breaking ground.
We have a great picture of him breaking ground. A great picture of him breaking into the cookie jar. Do they got an image of them breaking ground, digging my forefather up? Because that's what they need to have. Because all of this was unauthorized from the beginning, from Albert Pike's will. Them digging him up and putting him in that temple to make you think that's what it's supposed to be. And it is not. A bunch of flippy flop BS to be able to move finance around from the treasury. And then they skim off the top.
The other thing during this time frame that she does is he is in this process of really helping grow the Supreme Council. You know, when Pike, for example, was the Grand Commander, in his writings and in his allocutions and in his work, we see that he mentions that, well, the fraternity, the Scottish Rite fraternity at the time was maybe consisted of about a couple hundred Scottish Rite Masons. Mm-hmm. This was when he was Grand Commander. Through the time frame after Pike as well, when we get to Richardson, the fraternity, the Scottish Rite has grown tremendously. I mean, over hundreds of thousands of Scottish Rite Masons growing throughout the country. And so he's part of that initial swelling of Masons. He's the Grand Commander. He's the executive overseeing one of the largest significant increases of the Scottish Rite that has ever seen, exponentially.
Pike's transactions, 1857 to 1866, page 88, in the address of Pike, March 29th, 1860. For our rite was never intended to be a popular rite. The recipients of the higher degrees ought to be select, a few in each place, discreetly chosen. So why is this man sitting here talking about hundreds and thousands and he just swelled it up and made it so big? No, it's only going to be the few. Because again, for our rite was never intended to be a popular rite. The recipients of the higher degrees ought to be select. That means the few. That means the few, because adepts aren't made, they are born. There can't be hundreds and thousands because they're born adepts. You can't make them adepts. You all are traitors. You all are following traitors. And I just got a message from you telling me, quote unquote, this is nonsense. This is what they're saying. They're saying the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry Southern Jurisdiction told me that this is nonsense. That what I say is nonsense. Albert Pike specifically had in his will, he wishes to be buried in an unmarked grave. Where does he lay today? Not in an unmarked grave. He lays in a temple that you use to try to make it look like he co-signed your hand in the cookie jar or the treasury funds. And today, again, you don't teach nationality. You say you're Scottish. The other brother, what was he? Ruley? That's Italian. Ruley is Italian. What's nonsense is you don't teach nationality. You have all your brothers calling themselves white. You don't teach nationality, civics, or any kind of religion or nothing in the temples because you're dormant again. And this is coming from the bloodline of Albert Pike. So that's what's nonsense. You go measure up the property they said that they sold to be able to build that temple and look at that temple. Again, we went over the building of the temple, how they brought in all the big slabs and everything. It don't add up. They got into the treasury fund and somebody flying up the degrees, and then all of a sudden a rule or a law is changed saying that it's different now. Truth does not change nor pass away. So law, if it's truth, it will not change and it will not pass away. Whether you know or not, I think you really cheated yourself because it's obvious you're not studying. You're speaking of things that are very disrespectful and don't even know that it's disrespectful. They dug up my forefather when he said don't dig him up. So anything that comes after that is called the bad apple. Anything that comes after that is not authorized. And also, in regards to the authority or the perpetual authority, it's beyond the grave to the Pike daughters. That means the sons that come through the Pike daughters, they get the authority. In regards to just being a custodian of the truth, you can have your big shiny temple over there and y'all can line all up in the millions and say that you're master masons and all that. But you're not, because you don't have the gnosis. I hope you enjoyed the demonstration at the Cornish Temple. Peace and love.